Tsai. Tsai is a zero-day security researcher focusing on web application security, who attended many top conferences all over the world, but also he spoke at RomHack in 2019. So this is the second time he's at RomHack. And his talk today is about a 3-year tale of hacking a Pwn2Own target, the attacks, vendor evolution, and lesson learned. So, thanks.
Yeah, I still have time to drink one shot. Yeah, thank you. Oh.
Okay, I check. I think it's okay.
Okay. Wait. So is that okay? Oh, it's very strong. Oh my god. Okay. Oh, so I can start? Okay. Hi. Or I should say ciao. I'm Orange, and next I will give this talk with a long title. Yeah, before the talk first, regarding today's talk, there's a new thing I want to experience with. Usually, talks about the vulnerability researcher always end with a success. This type of presentation always have detailed techniques and impressive results. Of course, if it wasn't a success, it wouldn't be accepted by the conference. However, for today's talk, I want it to be more than just a zero-day showcase. I would like to share more about my thoughts and attempts during a research. Also, there are still some maybe technical details, but I would like to focus more on the path I have tried, the failure I have experienced, and my own reflections. Maybe it could be some references to your next hacking, maybe. And this is also a great excuse for me to sort out my temp folder. I believe many of us have this situation, have a lot of files like a.py, b.py, or test.py, and so on during research. So this is a good opportunity for me to organize everything into a talk. Okay, who am I? I'm Orange, and currently I'm the principal security researcher at DevCore. I have spoken at many top hacking conferences and got several awards, such as the Pwn2Own Champion and Pwn2Own Award. So why I am targeting Sonos? Back to the 2020, I was stuck at a big target and get tired of reviewing a bunch of web application code at that time. I would like to have something different. Right then, Pwn2Own came up. I picked the target that no one hacked before. That's the initial reason I chose Sonos. Before diving into this presentation, I would like to say that my talk is more focusing on the application layer attacks. So if you are looking for more deeper or low-level attacks, such as the hardware or trust zone attacks, there are some recommendable research that you should read. This is our schedule for 2020. I start reviewing the Sonos just 2 weeks before the registration deadline. Firstly, because we didn't have the physical device, most of our attempts are based on black box. We tried several attempts, such as fuzzing the website, searching for the firmware online, and even trying to exploit the firmware update mechanism. The web interface is the most straightforward attack surface. However, since we are based on the black box, most of the information gathering are based from the internet or by the tool like maybe Dearbuster. We know the web is mainly composed of two parts. The first part is for debugging. It shows several information and has a password-protected function, such as the unlock or developer mode for debugging. The other part is UPnP, which contains lots of SOAP operations, allowing the developers to control the speaker remotely, such as playing the music, turning up the volume, or setting alarms up. This is one of the debug patch. Looks interesting, right? Unfortunately, there isn't any simple bug such as the command injection. Yes, Orange used the command injection. It's not very effective. I'm pretty confident for this result, but if you find otherwise, feel free to ask me for a free beer by this presentation. Regarding to the SOAP operations, there is actually an open source project called Soco that lets you control Sonos by the API directly. For example, you can turn up or turn down the volume, play music from an URL, or even grab the information from the current song list. Of course, since Sonos trusted everyone from the internet by default, so without the firewall, you can also turn up someone's volume to the max and reload them remotely. So while exploring the API, we noticed a SOAP operation called begin software update. From its name, it seems to be an API to notify Sonos to begin the update. The API allows an user-supplied update URL. We try to give our own server to see what would happen. And we noticed that we received an HTTP request. What's more interesting is that the request comes from the wget. Using a black box approach is certainly inefficient. So to escape from this situation, we have to upturn the firmware so that we can reverse the mechanism. We download several firmwares from the internet. However, most of them are old and outdated. The newer firmware are encrypted and could no longer be analyzed by the being-work. And the latest being-workable firmware version is 45.1, which is roughly from the August 2018. Okay, even though it was from maybe 2 years ago, we had the binary at least. We discovered that this API is designed for firmware over the air. Its purpose is to provide device which might not have direct internet access and alternative way to get the firmware. The latest version of Sonos has the same wget behavior. Thus, we decided to reverse engineering the implementation of the begin software update from the old binary first. The entire mechanism works as follows. When the web server received a begin software update request, it calls XCVE to invoke the upgrade binary for subsequent processing. This binary then asks wget to fetch the corresponding URL and pipes the content to the standard out and pass it. With a proper understanding of the mechanism, we proposed several attacks. First, since we can use wget to access any URL. The first attempt we target the SSRF. However, we cannot find any good local service to exploit. Also, given that wget is used, our next idea was to check if there were any past vulnerability in wget we can leverage. But sadly, there wasn't any. We also delved into some firmware-related attacks, such as uploading a backdoor firmware or having a downgrade attack. Both attacks failed because the Sonos used an RSA key to ensure the integrity, and also used a hash to prevent you from the downgrade attack. So here is a code for you. If anyone here can crack this hash, please let me know. Maybe we can split the prize at Pwn2Own this year. So we failed all of our attempts, and eventually we turned our attention to the firmware parser. Since the upgrade binary operates as a standalone binary and process customized formats, it feels like playing a classic CTF challenge. And indeed, we identified a buffer overflow on it. We have exploited this buffer overflow on our local QEMU environment. However, for some reason, we couldn't exploit this buffer overflow on the remote lattice firmware. We couldn't exploit this buffer overflow on the remote firmware version. We get stuck in this situation and trying to adjust the offset blindly, and couldn't figure out if the lattice firmware is vulnerable or not until the competition ends. So to sum up our first year, we managed to develop an exploit that works on the firmware from 2018. However, it's useless against the lattice version. Looking back to my first year, I believe I made fair progress, especially considering that we only had 2 weeks time frame. The only thing where I see I could be better is that my speed in reverse engineering, especially in C++, could be faster. I will add it to my to-do list for future improvement. Okay, have discussed the first year. Let's move on to the second year. You might be wondering, why would I focus on the same target again? First, I don't like the feeling of defeat. Not getting any pre-auth RCE on my chosen target felt like losing. The other reason is that Synactive released a detailed article in March of that year, explaining how to use the hardware attacks to dump the memory. So I can learn a new skill and understand why we failed last year. Sounds great, right? So this time, we bought the equipment very early and allocate full 3 months to prepare for this competition. For the hardware component, we need a USB 3380 evaluation board. Also, these boards are actually sold out on online shops. But luckily, one of the resellers is based on Taiwan. I just gave a phone call, paid the money physically, and got it within 24 hours. And regarding to the hardware setup, since I am a hardware newbie, I spent an entire week and still couldn't get it right. The first problem I was met is why there is no response when I plug the evaluation board to my computer. At that point, I even suspected that I bought a broken device. And later, I came across a comment from the author on the GitHub issue stating that the hardware's USB interface is disabled by default. To use it, you have to first flash the firmware from the mini PCIe port. OK, please return my entire week. So after identifying the root cause, I proceeded to flash the USB. The initial challenge was finding the appropriate adapter. In this case, a mini PCIe to micro USB adapter, which proved to be difficult since most modern computers no longer use mini PCIe. I even took apart my own laptop, but I only find the M.2 interface instead of the mini PCIe. After conducting further research, I learned that the mini PCIe were primarily used in the laptop from the maybe 2010s for the wireless networked cards. Thus, I end up borrowing a ThinkPad T430 from a friend to continue this task. This is the Lenovo T430 from my friend. After removing the wireless network card, we finally saw the interface of mini PCIe. I excitedly plugged it and ready to flash the firmware, but suddenly an error message indicated that the ThinkPad has the whitelist for the mini PCIe devices. The BIOS would only accept the hardware from its allowed list. We brainstormed several ways to bypass this whitelist. For example, we can bypass this whitelist by flashing our own BIOS image. However, to do that, we have to jailbreak the ThinkPad BIOS first. This, in turn, requires downgrading to an older version that contains a known vulnerability. After all the hard work, my Windows finally recognized the evaluation board, and I successfully got a local root shell through the DMA attack. The entire process takes almost a week, and our vulnerability research is just beginning. After gaining access to the Sonos, we initially tried some straightforward bug hunting without overthinking. For example, we quickly reversed the implementation of all debugging paths, look for the paths that call the system commands or receive the network packets, and check for all unsafe string operations to see if there were any simple overflows. All of these attempts were unsuccessful. But even so, I have tried to check everything. Actually, I still overlook a significant bug. This overlooked bug eventually became a savior, rescuing me from the pain of the exploitation in the third year. So whenever someone told you they have checked everything and find no bugs, always stay skeptical. Without any success, I decided it was time to really use my brain. Firstly, considering that Sonos is a music player, it must support a bunch of media formats. In the Sonos, most of the media parsers are built upon the open source projects. Given the complexity of the media formats, I'm pretty sure that fuzzing could potentially find bugs. However, I have a personal preferences for spotting bugs with my own eyes. It's just my way with no right or wrong. Thus, I choose not to use fuzzing at that time. We then turned out our focus on how Sonos handle the metadata, such as the artist or the album name. This type of information isn't typically handled by pre-existing open source projects. It may all be done manually. It may all be done manually, which really caught my attention. So in my opinion, instead of learning little from reviewing the boring open source project, diving into their developers' approach gave me more insight to know their coding style. So following this line of thinking let me uncover my first bug. It was located in the part where Sonos processes the metadata for the unpack.ts format. Here is the decompiled result of IDEA Pro. As you can see, it first reads a byte, then use it as the length of the second read, and to fill the buffer. So theoretically, if the buffer has been defined to be less than 256, this would lead to a buffer overflow. We checked the buffer definition in the IDEA Pro. It seems to be only 0xD0. Everything looks right. Everything looks great, right? But no matter how hard we tried, we couldn't trigger any crash. It was only when we used GDB we realized that before the second read, the program would increase the stack pointer based on the length we got on the first read. So in reality, we got fooled by the IDEA Pro. The real code would probably involve the dynamic stack allocation by the function alloca. Hence, no matter how much length the buffer used, this code is definitely not vulnerable. So congratulations, we have our first fake bug. Here I would like to highlight a typical picture of a vulnerability researcher's daily life. While doing the vulnerability research, you will see a lot of hope first, and then you realize that there is simply no bugs. And when you think it's over, you grab a lifeline. And the lifeline is still a fake bug, and there is still nothing. But even so, you still can't give up because all the previous struggles have you understand the system more, and they are all the necessary part to finding the real bug. Anyway, after some time and efforts, we did find a real bug. This time, the bug was in the parser of the MP3 metadata. Here is a simple structure of an ID3 tag. An ID3 tag can have many friends, and different friends store different information, such as the artist, the comment, or the track info. The friend size shows the length of the friend data. The friend size shows the length of the friend data below. In the MP3 standards, the friend data should be a string. To read a string without a null byte, the engineers at Sonos decreased the friend size without any checks, and forgetting to check the condition that the size is set to 0. So there's an integer on the floor here. Of course, it's not that simple to reach this on the floor. You have to set some flags to ensure that the MP3 parser is in the mode of synchronization to trigger this bug. The subsequent process is not too difficult. This integer on the floor can be directly converted into a stack-based buffer overflow. Yes, and boom. The exploitation was straightforward. Since there was no PIE or stack canary, we can just replace the GOT of the string case compare with the system by ROP. Yeah, that's really easy. Okay, let's wrap up our second year. Firstly, finding a good attack service can really save your time. Just like this year, our entry point was entirely based on the handmade parser, which created by the Sonos developers. And looking back, I might have spent too much time going down to the wrong path. And talking about the hardware part here, I think try and error is fine, but blindly, either's attempts are not. So my takeaway is, instead of wasting time trying blindly, it's better to spend a little time first understanding the basics of the target. It can help avoid unnecessary detours. And another reflection is, did I get out the fasting too early? Because another thing that at the same year exploit the bug in the parser of media formats, which seems to have been fuzzable. And my final thought is always read the manual first. Like when I was trying the hardware attack and got zero response. If I had taken more time to read the manual, I wouldn't spend an entire week wondering whether the device was broken or not. Moving on to the third year of Pwn2Own. After focusing on Sonos twice, you might be wondering, why did I choose it again? The reason this time is pretty simple. I was completely blinded by the money. Last year, we just spent less than 1 month to earn about $60,000 US, and I'm thinking that the third year will follow the same easy way to be rich. But please allow me to give you a spoiler that the third year was not easy at all. We spent a full 3 months on these targets. Before the competition started, I happened to meet a friend from the NCC group at HitCon. We chat together, and he said, "Hey, did you know that Sonos has enabled all the binary protections now?" And I said, "What?" And we checked the latest binary, and shit. All the exploitation becomes much harder now. Okay, fine. In our third years, we continue to explore the good attack service we have last year, the handcraft part of the metadata parser. And sure enough, my choice didn't let me down, and I quickly find another issue. Last year, the bug we find was in the metadata parser of MP3. And this year, it was MP4. In an MP4 file, all metadata is stored in a container called a box. And MP4 can have several boxes, and each box is composed of size, type, and the box data. When parsing the FTYP blocks, the developer directly used the block size as the argument for the allocate function to allocate a buffer from the stack, and then read into it. So we have an arbitrary size allocate here. So we have an arbitrary size allocate here. And this block compared to the fake block we had before, this seems to be more promising. Here is the stack layout when parsing the FTYP blocks. As you can see that the return address is right below the local variables. And at this moment, our stack pointer points to the top of the local variable. And using allocate to allocate memory on the stack is pretty much like this. By subtracting from the SP, we take the unused part to serve as an allocated buffer. And then the box parser performs the operation on this newly buffer. And once the function ends, the SP is promptly pulled back, making everything we wrote as garbage. This doesn't affect any local variable or return address at all. Arbitrary size allocate may seem useless at the first glance, but if you think about it from a higher perspective, since the entire program operates as a multi-threading system, each thread has its own stack. So given that our allocate size is a 32-bit integer, can we jump a bit further? If by any chance there is another thread stack above us, we can override their thread stack. For example, we use allocate to allocate a huge size across several memory pages to write 4 bytes and close the connection immediately. And the stack pointer would jump back without any inference to the original process. So if we can control the address to be overwritten preciously, it turns into a pretty powerful vulnerability. Actually, there is a term to describe this bug type. It's called a stack clash. So in reality, we can turn this arbitrary allocate bug into a stack clash vulnerability. The next challenge is to convert this vulnerability into read and write primitives for further exploitations. Due to the time constraints, I will skip over many of the obstacles we encountered, such as the unpredictable layout of the thread stacks and the side effects of the stack clash. Today, I only want to highlight one special technique. When a stack clash occurs, all the other threads continue running and constantly changing their stack frame time by time. This means that finding the right moment to write, for example, modify the return address of other threads becomes a good question to the exploitation. We recall that the NS lookup featured in the web debug interface before. Through the reverse engineering, we realized that the implementation of this NS lookup works by calling the system called getHost by name. So an idea popped out in my mind. could we just run a DNS server on our own? On our own, and delay the DNS response by a few seconds. And during the delay, the code stack will surely be handled at the get host by name, and giving us full control over when to write. So using this approach, we managed to successfully perform the leak and gain the PC control through the stack clash. Everything is good. We bypassed all the OS protections and finished the exploit code on September 19. I remember that day was our research team's regular thing, and I was demonstrating to my teammate that how elegant my exploit was. And the next day, Sonos released an update that patched my bug directly. Here, I would like to circle back and highlight again the life of vulnerability researchers I mentioned earlier. There is definitely an additional stage at here. That's when your bug was patched silently. All right, at least we still have 2 months. We can just find another vulnerability if needed. Originally, I had planned to continue exploring this, our promising attack service. However, after a thorough investigation, it seems that I have exhausted most of the vulnerabilities here. This forced me to consider other potential attack surfaces. Given that Sonos relies on open source projects heavily, reviewing the open source project should be a good idea. However, I still want to focus on their own system, so I put more efforts into the integration part rather than the open source themselves. Whenever an open source project is introduced into an existing system, there is usually a handwritten code to combine them together. So if the developer is not fully understand the intent of that open source project, the chance of the mistakes should be pretty high. So therefore, I shift my focus to the integration part of the open source project. The first thing I noticed is that Sonos heavily relied on XML for data exchange. When it comes to XML parsing, they use the open source project called libxpad. And given that libxpad is a well-known library that should be extensively fast by the community, we can assume that the implementation is secure. However, what about the use of the library? Parsing XML isn't just calling the function. You have also to set up the corresponding user callback to handle each tag and the data yourself. And those user callbacks, and that's the user callback, that's where I felt might be a good place to find bugs. Here we see the callback written by the Sonos developers. Due to the library's convention, developers need to handle all XML tags within a single callback. And you can notice that how they are handling 2 tags here, the block and the parent. Whenever a block tag is encountered, it grabs some fresh memory and then fill it with the parent tag. And while they did put a limit, on the number of blocks, these restrictions is only applied within the block tag itself. So this is probably the XML format the developer is supposed to look. One block paired with several parents, and the other block pairs with other more parents. And once it hits the limit, it stops processing. But the developer didn't notice that the XML structure like this way, where we put all the blocks recursively. So when it comes to filling the value in the parents, an out-of-bound write occurs. Here we skip over several boring details, such as is the out-of-bound write. The out-of-bound write is dereferences twice, and we can't use any non-UTF-8 characters because the XML standards. Anyway, we overcome them all and have a good out-of-bound write that now. Can I have the power plug? I don't have power now. Ah, oops. Sorry. Oh, yeah, got it. Is that okay? Okay, cool. Thank you. Yeah, finally, we overcome them all, and we have a good outbound write that we can do anything. But the problem is, Sonos has enabled all the OS protections. Even we have the ability to write anywhere, we still don't know where to write or what to write. So we still need an information leak to know the memory address. We revised all the string operations and find an oversight bug that we missed in the previous year. The return of the SNPrintf can sometimes be larger than the size you provided. So if the program assumes that the return won't exceed the buffer size, it can lead to issues. Here is the Sonos case in the SSDP broadcasting. Sonos sent out the packet directly with the size of the return of the SNPrintf. That leads to an information leakage. To be honest, this oversight is unacceptable for me. However, no other teams used this information leak in the past 2 years either. So they probably made the same mistake as I did. Anyway, we have an out-of-bound write and the information leak. Everything is in my favor now. We chat all together on the October 18, and we saw Sonos release another update on the next day again. Is it a coincidence? I don't think so. We immediately checked what was updated. And the good news is that the vulnerable code of the out-of-bound write is still there. However, no matter how we test, the program did not crash. With deeper reverse engineering, we realized that Sonos had made a major overhaul of the entire architecture. And they removed all the entry points to the outbound write precisely. So even the vulnerable code is still there, we can no longer to trigger it. So is it a coincidence? I don't think so. Such timings are just too incredible to be a coincidence. And we recall that in the first year, we observed that Sonos would upload a crash dump. But we don't think it's a problem because if they checked the crash dump before, we couldn't win so easily in the second year. But at this moment, that's the only reasonable explanation that Sonos start analyzing every crash dump seriously. We also asked some researchers afterward, and indeed, they felt the same feeling well. Okay, well, fine. We still have about maybe 1.5 months left. We just accept it. There will always be other vulnerabilities there, and we can just consider there will always be other vulnerabilities here, and we still have 1.5 months left. And 1 month just passed. We found nothing. We have almost run out of all of my ideas. Here are some of our failed attempts, mainly targeting their handcraft part. We even start to give fuzzing a try. And 2 weeks left, and still nothing found. Since all the source code of Sonos is on GitHub, I even consider to hack into their GitHub account. All right, let's calm down. Take a deep breath and review vulnerability we have found in the past. What's the root cause behind this vulnerability? And how did the problem appear in the development cycle? And how did the problem appear in the development cycle? Under what scenario would the developer write code that results to these bugs? And the most important thing is we know the root cause and the reason how to find a variant. During the whole reviewing process, we stumbled upon something super interesting. Did you remember that the fact bug we find in the last year? The size of the second read is determined by the byte received from the first read, allowing us to write up to 255 bytes. However, since the buffer used allocat to allocate from the stack dynamically, we couldn't exploit it. I also mentioned that about 1 month ago, Sonos released an update that patched my XML bug and have a big update on their architectures. The big architectural update also turned this fake bug into a real bug. Originally, the fake bug couldn't be exploited because the dynamic allocation. However, somehow, maybe due to the poorly regression testing, the buffer size is the fixed value now. And as you can see, the buffer size is set to 184, and yet we can write up to 255 bytes. And we can override up to 7 pointers. This filing controls the broken counter, turning it into a very smooth buffer overflow. And of course, this time, we remember to cut off the cable. Yeah, this is also the vulnerability we demonstrated at Pwn2Own last year. It's time to share some reflections on the third year. First of all, I'm really glad that I didn't give up until the last moment. However, there are still things I have to improve. The first point I want to reflect on is my insufficient coverage on the binary-related bugs, such as the bug more related to the life cycle, or the overlooked smprintf bug. This prompts me to revisit my methodology again. My second reflection is around the time I spent analyzing the attack service, the SMB, in the open source project like SMB2 really scared me. That makes me to have a mistaken assumption that it was a complex library, so I choose not to delve into it. And by the end of the competition, all of other teams exploit the bug in the libsmb2 library to hack Sonos. So I think this should probably be the real shortest board of the wooden bucket for Sonos. The last point I need to reflect on is my not-so-good OPSEC. For instance, I should have set up the lab environment properly from the start to avoid getting disrupted by the automatic crash dump uploads. Okay, let's give a small conclusion for my 3 years journey. First, I always remember when I was young, I said I will hack into Facebook someday in the future. And it took me 4 years to finally do it. So how long could you persist on the same things? If your goal is to hack into maybe Google or NASA, 1 week, 1 month sounds unfeasible. However, if I give you 10 years to just hack one single target, it sounds to be more possible, right? So I think the persistence is the key. Just circling back, if I had given up the Sonos in the first year, this talk wouldn't be happened. Or I hadn't pushed myself until the very last moment to discover the fake bug becomes real, this story wouldn't be a successful story. However, while persistence is the key, I believe that persistence on the right path is even more important. For example, we all usually spend a whole night just to figure out something in bug hunting. So spending time to find bug is important. However, it's even more important to find bug on the right attack surface. That's why I said on the right path is more important. To give an overview to all the bugs I have discovered over the past 3 years, half of them are related to the initial good attack service, where developers manually wrote the metadata parser. So putting all together means you have to persist until you find the right path. It feels like facing a really tough boss in a game. Even you can't defeat the boss immediately. Spending at least a little time on it daily will have benefits. Whenever you learn something new, try to see if it can be applied on your target. Even you failed, at least you know one more wrong path they are not worth taking. Lastly, I want to share a quote with you all. That's from the game Celeste, which got the Games for Impact of the Game Awards 2018. Be proud of your death count. The more you die, the more you are learning. This gain not only won the gain of impact, but also the best independent gain of the year 2018. It's also my top 1 gain in my gain list. The gains design in how to get a sense of accomplishment is really textbook level. I truly recommend this to those who are stuck at something and can't move forward. It might become another source of some kind of achievement for you. So keep going. And this is the end of my presentation. If you have any questions, here are my contact information. Thank you again for being here. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you again, Orange. Great. Yes. So, questions for Orange? Raise your hands. I don't. Questions?
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Okay.
Hi. Hi, Orange. Great work. Thank you very much. In the MP4 bug, it's here.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. So, thank you very much. It's been a great presentation, actually.
Yes.
Really excellent work. I have a question regarding the MP4 bug. The MP4, the stack clash. So, basically, in the exploit, you said you leaked a pointer for the Pi and ASLR. How did you do that?
Oh, sorry, pardon?
In the exploit
of the stack crash.
Correct. You leaked a pointer in order to defeat Pi and ASLR. How did you do that?
Oh, because all threads are in the same binary, and the web thread is also on the same binary. So I leaked the pointer by modify the web threads, and I can get maybe leak information from the web. Yes.
Other questions?
Oops. Okay, finish.
That's all.
Okay, thank you.